This is Talk to Seattle, and I'm your host, Jason Rigdon. On this episode, we have Kevin Schofield from the Seattle City Council Insights blog. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing pretty good. Could you tell me a little bit about the blog?
Yeah, so I set up this website a few years back to really kind of focus in on what's going on with the Seattle City Council. We have this really interesting form of government here in Seattle where, unlike a lot of cities where they elect a city council and city council members choose a mayor among themselves, we have a true tripartite government here in Seattle where the legislative branch and the executive branch are completely separate. They're elected separately. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they don't agree, and there's more of a kind of a true oversight and budget control role for the city council, which is separate from what the mayor and the mayor's office does. And that adds a whole sort of dimension and interest in what goes on with the city council that a lot of folks just don't really understand. And it's kind of hard to follow on a day-to-day basis as they run a bunch of legislation through, as they try to do oversight, but they don't actually really control what every city department does, even though sometimes we like to blame them for everything that goes wrong with every city department. So I just found it like super, super interesting and a great just ongoing source of material and things to think about and talk about. And nobody was really, people touch on that when, they're writing about City Hall for the Seattle Times or KOW or, the other, local news outlets we have. But nobody really just kind of focuses in on how does the city council work? Well, how does that part of our city government work? What are they working on right now? What are the big challenges that they're kind of struggling with? And, what do we really think is going to happen there over the next, month, 6 months, couple of years? So I just found it super interesting. I'm kind of a wordy and nerdy kind of guy. So I'm a little bit, more of a quantitative analyst. So I like diving into the details of these things and reading the reports and reading legislation. I just find it super interesting.
And what kind of content do you post on the blog?
Sometimes it's stuff that comes out of specific committee meetings that they'll have or votes that they take on legislation. Sometimes it's several days in advance of one of those committee meetings, they'll post a bunch of information, draft legislation, reports from their own staff or from outside groups or from city agencies about what's happening in areas. And I'll read those. And so kind of as a preview of this discussion that's going to happen, I'll, write up something about here's what this report says, here's what this draft legislation says, here's what, according to the memos, they expect to be the issues that they really kind of want to wrestle through. So, people who read the things that I post can get kind of a preview of what's going on or really kind of understand more in depth the nuance of the issues that are really kind of central to this stuff. And the other thing that I do, I'm a little bit of kind of a legal justice wonk as well. So I will watch what happens with legislation after it passes and goes into effect to see are there legal challenges in court against it and kind of track a bunch of those. So as various high impact, high visibility piece of legislation have passed over the last 2 years, whether it's related to tenant rights or income tax or a number of other issues that the city council has been working through, and many of them have gotten challenged in court. I can just kind of follow that and help explain to a more general populace, here's the state of this legislation. Is it going well? Is it looking like it's going to get overturned? Is it going to continue to get appealed? How long is it going to be before this particular legislation, it has a final decision about whether it's going to live or die? So those I like to track those things, and that can be really arcane. Just trying to read through legal opinions and legal briefs and find out what's being argued there and what are the judges likely to decide. But, I think it's important to really understand, all right, what is going on with this legislation after the city council finishes with it? And is it going to, continue to live, or is it going to die an untimely death in court?
Well, your summaries and kind of digests of what's going on are so amazing because, that information is public, but it's just kind of information overload for the average person. So it's really great to have kind of like a digest of it.
Yeah. And I worked in the research lab over at Microsoft Research for 17 years. So I had a lot of experience in reading arcane papers and memos and trying to explain them in English to other people. And I also, got a fair amount of business training from Microsoft in that process. So I understand a lot about how budgets work, about how HR works, about how legal issues work. And so I try to take all of that experience and try to apply it to taking these arcane areas and, really kind of reinterpreting them in English so the rest of us can understand what's going on.
And how long have you been doing this?
I started this right after the 2015 elections. So coming up, it's about 3.5 years right now I've been doing this.
And how has it evolved given those few years?
Yeah, it's been quite the journey to go on this, and particularly as I've kind of built up a little bit of a readership following on this. So early on, I was just more trying to track kind of day to day. Here's what they're doing in this meeting. Here's what they're doing in that meeting. It's a lot less now about individual meetings. It's a lot more about, where do I think there are things that people need to know that they're not going to find out on their own, right? Where is there, a piece of legislation that somebody has to read through and figure out kind of what's going on in that legislation? Where is there topics that are important, but the rest of the local news and city hall reporters just aren't going to cover? Not because they're bad reporters, they're amazing reporters. And we're very, very lucky in the city to have some really, really amazing local reporters, but we don't have enough of them. And the constraints that they're in terms of what they can, write and get published, and the depth to which they can go into a bunch of these these topics, just makes it hard for us to cover everything. So I try to really aim for kind of a complementary role to what they do. If I know that the Seattle Times and Crosscut and KUOW are going to cover an issue really well, I'm less inclined to spend a lot of time kind of writing on that. I'm looking more for the things where they're not going to be able to have the time to do it, or they're just not going to get an article published on that topic. And then I can really dive in and present some information to, the local public here that they wouldn't otherwise get. And so I'm spending more and more time on doing that and less time on just kind of the day-to-day comings and goings and, schedule of what's going on. I do, try to do, once a week, every Sunday, publish here's what's coming up this week in council chambers. So everybody can see, okay, we've got these committee meetings going up. These topics are coming up. Here's a new legislation that got introduced this week. So everybody can kind of have the big picture following of what's going on. And then I've just become much more picky about the things that I'm willing to spend the time kind of researching and writing on around the things that I just don't think anybody else is going to be able to cover really well.
And how has the community reacted to this blog?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Part of the approach I've taken to writing this is to try to be, I guess, what you'd call opinionated, but not partisan or tribal, right? And so much of our local politics, it's less partisan because almost everybody's to the left of center in the city, but it is really tribal. We have a lot of special interest groups, and that's not being pejorative to any of them, right? There's lots of great causes to advocate for out there, and we have lots of advocacy groups out there. And sometimes they band together in loose coalitions to push a particular issue forward, sometimes not so much. And, when you publish something that supports their preferred worldview, the various advocacy groups try to grab onto, those articles and, sometimes me and sort of claim me as, one of them. And it's been a bit of a challenge to try to, sort of maintain independence and not allow myself to get claimed by any of them, whether it's on the left or on the right, or, the urbanists or the bicycle advocates or the transportation advocates or particular groups of advocates around a particular approach to the homelessness crisis or housing. There's just so many things going on, so many big important issues that we're struggling with. But I think it's important for me to be able to say, I have thoughts on all these things that are driven by kind of data and evidence and reports and work that people are doing to explore the issues. But, I at the same time, I think that a good idea can come from anybody and a bad idea can come from anybody. And if we allow ourselves to fall in this trap and say, well, I generally agree with this advocacy group, so I'm going to promote whatever they come out with. Or I generally disagree with this group, and so I'm going to be against whatever they come out with. We're going to end up promoting a lot of bad ideas, and we're going to end up rejecting out of hand what could be some good ideas, or at least a nugget of a good idea that needs more work, because we're just too quick to judge the group rather than particular ideas. So I always try to myself, reserve space to be an advocate or a critic for a particular idea, unless the group that was behind it or the individual that was behind it. So, even some of our more, polarizing figures in local politics, folks like Councilmember Shama Sawan, right? I agree with her on some issues and I disagree with her on other issues. And I'm willing to say that. And I think that frustrates some people who like reading my stuff, who expect, me to take a consistent, view that they can pigeonhole as being in this particular camp or that. And I really don't do that. But, I think at the same time, it's really important for our civic dialogue to be able to do that, to be able to look at ideas and judge them by their merits, regardless of who they came from.
So you've been doing this for several years now. Why do you think you're so fascinated with the city council?
Why am I so fascinated with the city council? It is, I watched through, a couple election cycles now, as it's really become a very activist city council, right? And by that I mean in many ways, the citizens of Seattle have elected activists, right? Environmental activists, labor activists, immigrant rights activists. You just go down the list, and they place people on the council who unabashedly go in advocating for particular issues and positions on those issues. Transportation, you just sort of keep going down the list, right? And just as the advocacy groups in the city, as I mentioned before, sometimes come together to form coalitions to push for a particular outcome or issue that they agree on. You see the same thing with the 9 city council members, where they will band together around a particular issue they want to push forward. And I think that it makes for interesting bedfellows, and I think it makes for interesting law. And I see them also struggling with, issues like the head tax, where it's really easy to fall into the trap of just listening to the people that agree with you, right? Or the ones you think are giving you a lot of political air cover, and not necessarily listening to the people who oppose you. And that can be an easy path, but it can also be a trap. And I think we saw that with the head tax, right? Where, there was a working group, which was largely stacked with people who agreed with, a small number of council members who were pushing for a particular outcome from it. And they legislated the outcome that they were looking for, and then found out that there was a large set of people in the city who disagreed with them on that, and they had to backtrack, and that was super painful. But I think that process of, whether you want to call it the Seattle process, maybe that, writ large, certainly it's the Seattle process, but that process of how a piece of legislation works its way all the way through, who speaks up for it, who speaks up against it, and how the coalitions get built around it, both among the advocacy groups and among the city council members, I just think is a fascinating, dynamic process. And every time you think you understand who the factions are, they shift, right? There are many times over the last couple of years where I thought I understood which city council members were going to consistently vote as a block. And I've been wrong on many, many occasions about this, because these guys just aren't that predictable on this. They have strong minds and strong opinions. All 9 city council members are very, very smart and have strong views and are willing to argue for their views. And, and I think in part that process makes for better legislation, but it also makes for some really interesting conversations along the way about what are the priorities of this. And we saw a lot of that play out with NHA legislation, and understanding to what extent the city council wanted to make exceptions for particular neighbors and neighborhood groups who were had real reservations about some of the more dramatic changes that were being proposed for their neighborhood. And in cases where the city council members said, no, I think we need to be consistent across the entire city on this, and not make exceptions, or make very, very few exceptions. And so there is a very healthy tension there among the city council members that I think in the end made for better law in that process. And that's just always interesting for me to kind of watch that play out.
Do you have any opinions about why so few city council members are not running for, I think I'm doing a double negative there. Give me just a minute.
Why are so many city council members who are incumbents deciding not to run for re-election? I think for a number of reasons, the politics in Seattle have just turned toxic in a lot of ways, or they can turn toxic very quickly. And, in part, I think it's because of shared frustrations that we all have with some issues like homelessness and housing that just don't seem to be getting better anywhere near as fast as we all would like them to do that. I think there's some frustration with an activist city council that it has become close, in some ways that I was talking about earlier, with specific advocacy groups, and maybe shutting out other views in that process. And certainly people who feel like they have been shut out of the conversation are more upset about that. And that, I think it's worth pointing out that being shut out of the conversation is something that a lot of marginalized groups have felt for decades, if not forever, in this city. And so some of the frustration we're seeing now is groups that have traditionally felt like they've had a seat at the table now no longer feel like they have a seat at the table, while other groups that have been historically marginalized now see, in some cases, they at least for a fleeting moment have a seat at the table, but certainly don't feel like all their issues have been resolved. So I think, but I think there's broad sensitive frustration about, we have a lot of problems here and we don't seem to be making a lot of progress on fixing that. And then I think the anger just spills over really quickly, and the anger in many cases spills over to elected officials. And I've spoken individually with a number of the city council members just about how challenging it's been for them to be in this job and just deal with that level of toxicity day after day after day. And it's not necessarily people showing up at city council meetings during public comment and yelling at them, although there's a lot of that from all different sides. It's, people running into them at the grocery store and yelling at them, or worse, people, giving their kids a hard time in school, or their spouse or significant other at the grocery store, right? To the extent that it's not just them individually, but their family who's really also feeling the blow of just this toxicity of Seattle politics and the anger spilling over into all these different places. I think a lot of them just said, I've had enough. I feel worn down by this, and it hurts me to see the effect that this has on my family. And I've just had enough.
Do you have any ideas about what we can do as citizens to reduce that toxicity?
Well, I'm trying to do my part, right? I have a couple principles for how I write on my site, and one of them is kind of what I was saying earlier about being wordy and nerdy, right, and writing the kinds of stories that other people can't write. But the one being be opinionated but not partisan or tribal, and the third one is really be non-toxic, right? We don't have to have a toxic conversation about these things, right? If we can. If we can stay compassionate but dispassionate at some level about it, and not sort of personalize it, and understand that there really is a lot of nuance and complications of these issues, and we're not ever going to come up with a perfect solution, right? And we need to be patient with that. And some of these kinds of legislation, we're going to have to iterate a few times in them. We're not going to get it right the first time. We're going to have to come back a couple of years later and make it better. MHA is not the perfect piece of legislation. There's a bunch of problems with it, and there's a bunch of pieces to which we really just don't understand the extent of how it's really going to work out. And it's going to need to get, at the very least, fine-tuning, if not some, major structural upgrades along the way to trying to get it right. And, the MHA legislation is not going to solve the housing problem alone. It's not going to deliver all affordable housing. We have to do other things as well, right? So, I think it's really important that people be engaged in the conversation. I think it's important that we all really try to get educated about what the issues are, look at it from all the different sides, understand what are the intended consequences, what might be the unintended consequences, but at the same time, we can't be afraid to try things as well. So I'm trying to do my part with this. I think the one most important thing I aspire to do with this is add some more protein to the diet of our civic discourse and put more information out there, better analysis, better quantitative analysis, really trying to help us all understand, why is this issue complicated? What are the different paths forward? What are the different options forward? Who has good ideas around this? What ideas might not be so good? And hopefully bring us all along a little with just trying to have a better civic conversation that isn't so angry all the time, isn't so personalized all the time, and just helps us to get better answers to a bunch of things that we're struggling with in our city.
And have you ever thought about running for city council yourself?
I get asked that all the time. So I have, because people ask me all the time, I have thought about it. I'm not interested in running for elected office. I really like what I'm doing right now, and I feel like I'm adding value to our civic conversation by doing this. There is. I will certainly admit there are days where I'm watching the city council sit around the table and have the discussion to go, no, oh God, I just wish I was sitting at the table so I could say this thing and try to sort of move this in the right direction. But I think I'm doing good. I hope I'm doing good in what I'm doing right now, and adding something to our conversation. And I think it's important. And if I stop doing it, I'm not sure somebody else would pick it up right away. Again, I love the City Hall reports. I had, so many opportunities to interact with, all the rest of the City Hall reporters as we sit in press conferences, and, we run into each other in City Hall all the time, and City Council meetings. And I'm just super, super impressed with their intelligence and the quality of the work that they do, and their passion for doing a really, really good job on it. But there aren't enough of us, right? And there's just so much surface area to cover in our city government and in these issues that, I feel like, where could I do more good? Could I do more good running for office or for doing what I'm doing right now? And the conclusion I keep coming to over and over again is I could add more value doing what I'm doing right now. So I'm going to keep plugging away at this. And hopefully people keep telling me where I'm doing good and where I'm not.
So you've probably been to just tons and tons of city council meetings. Do you have any advice for citizens that are attending these meetings?
I'd say a couple things. One, despite some of the press coverage lately that suggests otherwise, the city council members do really listen to what people say at public comment. But I think a lot of people waste the 2 minutes that they get and really don't do a very good job of sort of starting with, here is my here is my conclusion. Here's the point I want to get across, and then focusing on telling the council members things that they don't already know. Tell them the things they don't already know, because that's what's going to catch their attention. And the other thing I'd suggest is stay to the end of the meeting, because after the meeting, you can often catch the ear from the city council members before they head out of the room and just have a chat with them. And they're all 9 of them nice people, and they actually want to talk to constituents, and they're interested. And if you spoke at public comment and then try to catch them at the end, they'll remember you, and they'll want to have more conversation and maybe connect you up with one of their staff members to follow up on a particular issue that you have. They want to be helpful, and sometimes it's just a matter of actually being able to just have a conversation. So stick around to the end. That's how I kind of got hooked on this. I was showing up at the beginning for a particular issue, and then I stayed to the end of the meeting and listened to the whole thing, got a chance to chat up a couple of them afterwards, and just realized that, these issues really are complicated and nuanced, and there aren't going to be easy answers or obvious answers to a lot of them. And, the hard work of the city council members is just showing up every day and plugging through those details and trying to make the legislation better and trying to do something that'll improve the lives for people here in Seattle.
And how can people support your work?
Let's see. They can obviously read it and pass on articles to other people. I have a Patreon site where I take donations from supporters, and it can be as little as $1 a month or more if you really enjoy it and get more value out of it. And I appreciate every single person who takes the time to both send me comments, either positive or negative, as well as provide some kind of financial support. It's very, very much appreciated. And I would just put in a plug for our other local news outlets. Make sure that you're supporting Seattle Times and KUW and Crosscut and other local journalists that you think are doing a really good job, because there aren't enough local journalists. There certainly aren't enough City Hall reporters. They don't get paid very well. And we are continuing to see local news organizations fail. Like we just saw Seattle Weekly, close up their print shop recently. Stranger has pulled back significantly in what they're doing. It is a real struggle for local journalism, but we are all going to miss it when it's gone. So it's super important that all of us be supporting it, including financially supporting local journalism now while we still have it, because it's going to be super hard to get it back later once it's gone.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
You've been listening to Talk to Seattle, and I've been your host, Jason Rigdon. If you want to support the show, would you please follow us on social media? We're at Talk to Seattle on both Twitter and Instagram. Thank you for listening.